All right. Why don't we get started? Thank you everyone for coming today. Sisi is going to give us maybe like a little background on what she's going to talk about today, and then we will take any questions you have. This is a great opportunity to ask questions, really specific ones or really general ones about redesigning your meeting agendas, being inclusive, including people who aren't in the room. And if you want, you can also type in the chat box and I'll read your questions out if Sisi is busy answering something else. So we'll be here to answer whatever questions you have and help you along with your agendas in any way we can. So Sisi, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Kat. So like Kat said, this is definitely going to be a majority focused on your questions session. And so I just want to make that clear from the beginning. So if you have stuff you want to ask, even if it feels really particular to your situation, I bet it's not. And so just sort of percolate on those as I sort of give some background on how this all started and what's going on. So I'm Sisi Wei. I am a RJI fellow this year, and we have at least one other fellow in the audience, which is very exciting. But basically, the fellowship sort of supports us doing some experimental projects that we are trying to do to support journalism in some way. And it was really awesome that I have been able to continue doing DI coalition work as part of my fellowship with Kat this year. And so for those of you who are not familiar with what the DI coalition is, basically this March, Open News, which is where I work during the day, and over 100 members of this broader journalism community spent the last, I think 6 months or so before March working together to create a digital community space. It's hosted on Slack, and it's committed basically to sharing knowledge and taking concrete action in service of creating this more anti-racist, equitable, and just journalism industry. And that whole process was extremely collaborative. I was more of like a host facilitator. I was not the person who made all the decisions or anything like that, but rather people made decisions together. And as part of that process, we had to figure out ways to work together because here's like over 100 people. We don't work at the same organization. We don't work at the same location, right? And so how do we get together, make decisions together, listen to each other's ideas when it kind of becomes impossible that we would sync up to meet regularly, right? And so that led to me publishing 2 articles in these last 2 months. And they were focused on how, sort of out of necessity of trying to figure out how do we do this in a way that feels equalizing, right? And equitable. How do we have a brainstorm meeting that allows people to participate live if they can, but also be an equal participant if they're participating on their own time? Right? If they just can't make the live time that say 30% of people can make, and that's it. And how do we make that experience really nice for people and really welcoming, and then build in a process such that afterward, everyone's thoughts, whether it was live or on your own time, is considered together and sort of synthesized together. So I'll drop in an article or the links to the articles as well, but I'm assuming some of you came specifically because you've read them already. But if you haven't yet, they also include sort of my why behind it. And I can go over that just very, very quickly. But then it also includes the second piece, templates from an original sort of how I hosted a live meeting, and then the changes that I made to change that live meeting plan and agenda into something that is almost like a worksheet that is enjoyable to go through on your own time if you couldn't make it live. So, okay, so here's my basic rundown of the challenges that were happening. In this sort of space of 100 people trying to work together, right? One, we knew that limiting perspectives results in worse work, right? Just more people who bring in their experiences, the better. And so if we were going to have only live events where people could participate, we knew we were limiting the number of people who could come just from pure logistics. And even if everything is online, that was part of the consideration there. And every time we went out of our way to make sure that anyone could participate if they wanted to, we got better results, right? And that was just over email. And so when it came to brainstorming meetings or decision-making meetings, we wanted to make sure not to have that limitation. The other thing that I mentioned earlier, right, is that it just became really clear live brainstorming doesn't let you scale. If we're doing this on a regular, not even a regular basis, but like every time something comes up that we want more people's perspectives on. And we, in designing a community together, ran into this a lot. There's just like a lot of things that we could make decisions on, a lot of things we wanted to have the benefit of everybody's experience. And then finally, like sometimes in person just wasn't possible. Like there are great events or conferences that in the before times, I would say, we could probably congregate around. But even if there wasn't a global, pandemic going on, that is still, it still just sort of like limits what's possible if you do in person. And so the synthesis of all of this is that we came up with this process very organically, I would say, while working together, in which we would distribute a very clear agenda for what we were going to do today. So like, we're going to brainstorm on like safety today, right? Or we're going to brainstorm on how moderators are structured. And I think in a newsroom scenario, it's very analogous to saying like, we're going to brainstorm how we're going to do election coverage differently this year, right? Any topic. We have a very clear agenda. We work in that agenda together during the meeting. And so like, if I'm asking people to brainstorm ideas, it all goes in together and it gets recorded in people's own words. And then thinking about, okay, now if I couldn't come, how do I like go through this and not feel like a second tier participant, right? Like all these people already said stuff, like I wasn't there, I could see them riffing off of each other, etc. And going through this process in which you actually, as the host, redesign that agenda completely geared towards people who are now working on it either by themselves or maybe like with another person at the same time, but that it feels actually like a really nice exercise for them. And they also have that opportunity for other people to riff off of them. So that's my like 7-minute self-introduction and summary of what we covered. But I would love to sort of know more about questions that you all have, and like any particular struggles or challenges that you have as well when it comes to like, my meetings are not effective and how do I get us out of this situation? Yeah. So I'm just gonna pause for a moment, just give people some time to let me know what their questions are. Yeah, okay. So Megan has a question. I'm also super chill with like writing time where no one talks. So as I sort of like talk through Megan's question, please feel free to leave them in there as they come to you as well. So Megan asks, how do you include people who are less likely to even jump in a collaborative document because they are less tech savvy? This is a great question. So a couple ideas come to mind, and Megan, if you have more details for like the why behind someone maybe less tech savvy, which I would also interpret as like maybe a little averse, right? Like they don't want to use the tech is a vibe that I'm picking up from this question. Please let me know. So there's a couple things. One is I feel like you want to remove as many technical barriers as possible. So one of the essentially like websites that we recommend for hosting these agendas on is this website called Etherpad. And the nice thing about Etherpad is that if you open it up in your browser, you don't have to like log in or anything like that. You can just write. And in Google Docs, you can try to do the same thing where like it's public to everyone who has the link, that kind of thing, just to eliminate one barrier. I think the other thing is that, and I think this is true for me too, as someone who would consider myself like a first adopter kind of person where like I love playing around with new tech, is that before I was exposed to jumping into a collaborative document, like I was also not emotionally prepared for that when I had never experienced it before. So I think there's sort of like both of those fronts, and a potentially interesting way to get people into it is to invite them to maybe a meeting that they care about what you're talking about, but maybe like they don't have to participate, just so they can watch what happens in the document. Because it really changed my understanding of what's possible when I witnessed it for the first time, where I was like, wow, I can see essentially 5 people speaking simultaneously through writing, which can't happen out loud. And then for people then to respond to each other. And it just felt like, felt very different. And I think if what it takes for someone to like get that feeling and experience is to come and hang out at a meeting that you run on a different topic first, I think that could be one option as well. Okay. I also see a question in the Q&A part of the Zoom. So either part works. And Megan, if you have any follow-ups, feel free to leave comments in the chat. So Esther has asked, can you elaborate on how the redesigned brainstorm agenda for async participants look different from the original agenda? Yeah, so in the second piece that I linked, there are 2 Google Doc examples in which I've sort of marked it up in comment mode, in suggestions mode, so that you can see what I'm literally changing from one to the other. And I'll just sort of like highlight a couple of themes of like what types of, oh, we cannot see the links in the chat. Oh, you know what? One second. What a great, it's because my settings are wrong. Here are some links in the chat that is now shared with more than just me and Kat. And thank you, Emma, for letting us know. So if you click on the second link, it has the links to both templates so you can see what I'm changing, but also my like brief example of how that works. But there's a couple of like themes that I'm going on here. So when you're changing it, there's this shift in focus in which your goal is to make this document now feel like its primary audience is the people who are working on it on their own time, right? So if you had like logistics information in there before that was about like the Zoom URL is here and like it's at this time on this day, like you can keep that, but then I make it like I bring it a little lower and I write at the top like asynchronously open for people until blah blah date. And the information for your asynchronous participants always come first, and everything, instructions that are specifically for your live participants, you can preserve them, but deprioritize them throughout the whole thing. And then something else I do is that like if there was anything that I said out loud, and I feel like I prepare for live meetings in a very specific way, which is that I don't always write out every single thing I'm going to say, right? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And so if I find myself saying things that are actually really helpful for the meeting in the live version, Then when I'm preparing the asynchronous version, I don't try to say exactly the same thing. Like I don't try to look into my memory and repeat what I said out loud. I try to see if like throughout our conversation, I figured out a better way to say it, or from feedback from the live participants when they're like, oh, I'm confused about this. What did you mean? I like incorporate all of that in there and I write a new description of what I was saying into that model. So hopefully that's also like a way that you've learned something from the live version that you can pass on to folks who are doing it asynchronously as well. And then finally, sometimes I write explicit instructions for asynchronous participants. And so the thing that's in the meeting template that's most obvious at the top is I write like a special intro / welcome for them to make it very clear to them, like, I have thought about this more, and now this document is for you. And like how to think about that, or like inviting them to write in the open spaces, that kind of thing. So that's sort of like the thematic changes that I have in there. And I also I move lower down all responses that were recorded from the live meeting to make like this huge open empty space so that anyone who's asynchronously participating knows like, oh, this is my space to write, right? I'm not coming in after. I get my own designated space. Yeah. And then I saw Megan wrote in here as well, yes to a verse, or in the field, their job relies less on technology. Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. I think for folks who don't use technology at all in their day jobs, I would say like, luckily, I do feel like something like a Google Doc is common enough for like personal use, right? That people are at least familiar with the technology. And so I would definitely not introduce new technology that they haven't used before, if that's a scary thing. But I know what you mean in that, like, I think there's like every newsroom that I've worked at has been like, oh, how do we get, I don't know, 30% of our staff to actually join the company Slack or like whatever. So there's always sort of technology issues like that. And I think a lot of it is just like folks don't see the benefit of like, what am I going to get out of it if I join? Like I am happy to talk to people on the phone, etc. And so you just kind of have to demonstrate what is actually different about this, which is like it's not the same as texting or chatting with your friends, but rather it's actually a different kind of meeting experience that benefits your other colleagues. And I would like always sort of like defer to the show, don't tell part of it to help them see like, oh, like this could be my experience. It could be pretty fun. Other questions? The other thing that I will sort of like prompt for questions on too is that when I wrote this last piece showing the difference between what the meeting agenda looks like live versus what it looks like remodeled, what I didn't really have time to do, because it would be its own whole piece, is like, why did I make the design decisions I made in the first place for the live agenda? And I like covered some things very briefly, just so people understood like why something exists. But I think you may also notice that the live meeting agenda does not look like a ton of regular meeting agendas either. And so if you have questions on that, I'm super happy to answer that as well. If you've been in meetings with me, it will look similar to all of my meeting agendas, or with Open News overall. Oh, whoops, that is not correct. Kat, if you don't mind reposting the DI Coalition link, I realized I couldn't copy it from yours and send it to everyone. Okay, so Emma says, these docs are very long. How can we help design them for skimmability and folks who are not as intensely participating as we would like? Emma, do you mean the template docs are very long, or do you mean the articles are very long? I think you mean the template. Yeah, okay. So I would say a couple of things. You could, like, if you have a purpose in mind, like I have a group of people or a specific person and I want them to participate in just one part of this, and the rest of it is actually just not as relevant to them or interesting to whatever their challenges are, whatever they're working on. You could direct them specifically to one part. Part of the reason why the docs are long is because I just like left a bunch of blank space. But I think like linking to specific parts of a document is one option. The other option is that if you like, you could use headers a little differently than I do. So the way that I use it is that there's just like a little bold phrase that tells you what each section of the doc is about, right? I could totally see you adding something to that, which is like labels that say things like decision point or like context information, right? To give people like cues for, if I already know this, I don't need to read this. I would say that the other thing is that without changing the template itself, something that we did during the DI coalition is that we just told people specifically what we wanted when we sent the agenda to them. So I'll give you an example. We might say something like, one of the committees has already like talked about what our community agreements are going to be this year, or for the DI coalition Slack. And community agreements for us are similar to code of conduct. They're a little different. And we could say like, at this point, we're having like a meeting because we're having a lot of trouble figuring out like how many moderators do we need, and like what should their job really be? So if you have a interest in that or a lot of experience in that, we would love for you to go through this in depth and just offer your thoughts. If you just want to like check it out, feel free to like skim through, but you don't have to leave any comments or something like that. But basically directing people like, how should I interact with this document before they even see it, is another recommendation that I would make. As folks are thinking of questions as well, I would also kind of love to know, like, what types of meetings are you interested in doing this kind of treatment for? Or if they're like a type of meeting that you've been frustrated with, and that is why you came to this Q&A. If that prompts sort of an immediate reaction from anybody, I would love to see your answers in the chat. Status update meetings. Yeah, that's a whole thing. There's I don't know, like, I feel like sometimes I don't know how to like remake status update meetings to be as efficient as you always want them to be. But there is like a couple there, what am I trying to say? There's like a lot of people who think about how to design meetings, I'll put it this way, that I've seen sort of online and who care about this a lot, would probably argue that status updates should not be meetings anymore. And that it is probably the most common meetings that are held. But in terms of like how to make them better, I will say that like I think actually doing the interactive agenda version makes them faster, like it, and more consumable. So that may help, which is like, let's all type our status updates together and then have conversations about the things that are confusing or people want more information on. But yeah, status update meetings are a struggle, I think, for a lot of people. What's the best feedback you've gotten during this process so far? That's a great question. I feel like this is like just like a tiny bit of feedback that I got once, but it felt really good because I felt like I accomplished my goal, which is that I did this after the DI coalition launched with a smaller group of people, like say like 50 people or something like that, specifically to try to figure out some next steps for the coalition. And we put the async version out in the Slack, and one person, I think I might have put it out like on a Friday or something like that. And we had the meeting on Thursday or Wednesday. And I had one person write back directly that was like, wow, this was like a really enjoyable activity for me to do to wind down my entire week. And it just felt really nice. And I was like, that is exactly how I want you to feel when you're going through like something like this, because live versions of brainstorm meetings are also often very energizing, right? And so to have an experience like that, I thought was really nice. The other feedback that I have gotten is that more people are thinking about this, but didn't necessarily have the same words to talk about it. And so now I'm sort of in touch with some folks who are trying it out, but maybe for a different process, like not brainstorming meetings, but for like design thinking or something like that. And so I'm sort of like waiting to hear how it goes with them and like what differences there are when the goal of the meeting is a little different. So I'm excited about that, and maybe I'll be able to share more about that later once I know. Let's see. Yeah, so Megan left a comment about, yeah, so you're new to org, and I see some things in your comments that are really common, especially in journalism, but just everywhere, which is that there's not a ton of systems in place, and meetings aren't very well planned, right? They're probably usually impromptu. There's probably usually no agenda, or like not even a mental agenda that people know about. They just know it's a topic and then they show up. And I think brainstorm meetings are often, yes, Megan. And I feel like brainstorm meetings are a good, I almost want to say like they're like a really good Trojan horse for you to like insert better meeting practices at a place that doesn't think about it a lot, because brainstorming usually is not about something negative, right? It's usually something that is geared towards like doing something in like new, exciting ways, and we all get to use like our creative muscles, and is like forward future thinking. And to me, this is like a bigger zoom out, but to me, a lot of change, no matter what it's about. Like we're talking about meeting agendas today, but like a lot of change comes from helping people experience something that is better than what they're used to. And they're like, wow, I want that all the time, right? So like, how can I make my other meetings feel that way? And I think brainstorming meetings have like a lot of the components necessary for that. Okay, so thank you, Emma, for generating questions for us. So what are some challenges someone might face in implementing this kind of thoughtful change into their newsroom? How can they break those barriers down? Okay, so I'm gonna just like come up with some, I'm sure, that exist in organizations. One is that people might not be willing to pay attention. Like I see this in newsrooms a lot, which is like people come to a meeting, but they expect to like also work on their phone or something. And when it's in the virtual world, I could totally see that being just much easier because you're on the meeting, but you're also on your computer. I think there are certain practices that are in my live meeting agenda that if you've never done them or if your company has never done them before, I would like test them out to see how people react and if it captures everybody's attention. Because it's one different, like people are like, wait, what's happening in this meeting that I'm listening to in the background? Maybe gets their attention, but then two, like asks them to actively participate in some way that is a little more proactive. And so I have these things in the live meeting called check-in moments. It's something that I've only learned recently and have been implementing like a ton of like just all the time when I'm in meetings. But it's basically asking people to share like, where are they at right now when they enter this meeting with you? And it's to help you sort of help them and help everybody who's in attendance take care of each other. And so in the template, there's like a couple different examples of what a check-in moment is. But by asking people to participate by like writing in the doc, it's something that they have to do. And then they see other people do it and sort of draws people back in. And I think if you have a meeting culture that is like people multitask all the time, it's a lot harder to have effective meetings because people just are not paying attention. And so something like that could be a good way to help people understand like, oh, there's a signal that something's different here and I'm being asked to participate literally. If people have other specific challenges, I'm super happy to address those as well. And then Yua asks, can you talk more about design decisions you make in designing a meeting agenda, even for in-person meetings? So this dovetails really well. And I'm actually going to open up just my first live meeting agenda real quick, just so I have that in there. Okay, so a couple of strategies here that I'll sort of call out a little more. I talk about this only a little bit in my notes in the template itself, but one thing is that when you explain something to people, so like sometimes you have to explain something like your goals or the context, or maybe like the guardrails, right, that you have to adhere to in this brainstorming meeting, or whatever other like generative meeting you're in. Something that I have learned that is actually really helpful is if you leave room to ask people if they understand what you just described, and to specifically ask them. And so I have the language example in the first live meeting agenda template, which I will post here, which is giving them this scale, which is like 1 to 5, how clearly do you understand blank, right? In my case, it's like, how do you understand the context and reasoning behind like what we're doing today? And having people be able to live respond to you being like 5, it's crystal clear, I could totally explain it to someone else. 1, I'm actually really confused. I don't know what you mean. And the first time this happened at a meeting that I was at, and I link folks to the folks at Aorta that taught me this technique, I was like, oh my gosh, this blows my mind, because sometimes the speaker is really not in sync with like the audience if people are not willing to share how they feel. And so asking explicitly, and then you get like a bunch of 5s, you're like, great, I'm good to go. But if you get a bunch of like 2s and 3s, you're like, okay, so like people don't understand, I need to figure out why. And it's crucial that they understand before we really go into the next step, right? And so that's something that I've really loved, and it doesn't take a lot of time. And then I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but once you get that feedback, right? If you get a bunch of twos, then you're definitely not going to explain it the same way to your asynchronous participants, right? Because they just definitely won't understand. And you get that feedback now, so you can at least make it better for people coming in after this as well. So I really like that. The other thing is that there's this sort of like spaciousness when you're designing a live meeting agenda that people are going to interactively collaborate in. There's always this sense of like space. So you could see this meeting agenda and think like a version of this does not include empty bullet points, right? And that's, to Emma's point earlier, is also what's making it really long, right? But the fact that you have those bullet points in there is sort of a visual signal that people can fill it up, right? As opposed to needing to create a bullet that declares that they're going to take up space. You have created space that they have every right to take up for them. And so as you're facilitating a live meeting, welcoming people to do that is actually, I find it to be a much more frictionless experience. And as soon as one person starts doing it, other people immediately pick up on what they're supposed to do. And it's a very specific feeling. And we've taken this, so like a lot of my work here on meeting design overall is based off work that Open News has done for a long time. And since I've been here for 2 years, I've taken this to other conferences to see like how it would go. Because at Open News's conferences, people are like used to this. They're like, oh yeah, like we're always going to be in a dock together. And like we took something like this to ONA earlier this year. People picked it up right away, right? It was just like, wow, okay, like when I see it, I get it. And so I do love creating this sense of like space that is yours, like the participants, it's your space. It's not my space as the host. And so using that technique as well. Yeah, if people find this entire transformative process to be daunting, what's one small change they can try in a snackable size? So I think that if you want, there's a couple things. If you are specifically trying to get more people to be able to participate on their own time, but you feel like it's like too much to ask your workplace culture to get in a collaborative doc with you. The other thing you could do, right, is you could design the same sort of like agenda that you would normally design, and then like assign a couple of people just to take notes on what people are saying out loud, right? So and I would suggest that it's not you, because you have to host the meeting. But if you just get like 1 or 2 people to volunteer to take notes, so that people who are not there can understand what happened, you can start there. And then, since this is sort of work that you can do on your own without other people pitching in, then take their notes and then redesign their notes to sort of be geared towards asynchronous participants, and have those folks fill stuff in. The other thing you could do is, like, if you're not ready even to like do that redesign process, you could also just take like one thing in here where you're like, oh, I wish someone did that at my meeting, and just do that at your meeting, right? Like if you want to ask people, if you just want to have a check-in moment at a regular meeting that you have, you could just like insert that one thing in. There's no docs that people are looking at, but you're asking folks like, hey, if you could just put this in the chat for me, let me know how well you understand this. 1 means you're confused, 5 means you could explain it to someone else. And that's sort of a good way to try out like little bits and bobs of techniques one at a time, instead of feeling like, okay, I now have to like rethink my entire meeting design process. Like iteratively stealing one thing from these templates at a time is a totally acceptable way to do this. And I did not like suddenly one day start doing all of this facilitation this way, right? Like it is a culmination of where I'm at now. And I'm sure other facilitators would have techniques that like I've never heard of and would love to have as well. So that's a great question. Thank you, Emma. The idea of creating a space for people to feel that this meeting is the attendees instead of the hosts. Are there other tips on how to create the sense of ownership in meetings? Yeah, so I think anything you can do to prompt people to take up space is also helpful. So a couple of things. One is you could have these things sent out early enough so that people could write in it ahead of time. That's one option. There isn't an example of that here, but you could easily like, like what are some pressing things you want to talk about? Question mark, and then open up a lot of bullets that are empty or something. And in the email introducing it, say like, throughout the week, as you think of things, feel free to just drop the idea in there. Think of it as a storage space for yourself or something like that. The other thing, and the reason why this is also first, is that like you want a low stakes way for people to feel like I can write all over this, right? And so the first thing that I ask in both of the meeting templates is like, who's here? And like, how do you feel today? What's one word that describes how you feel today? And then people just write their names in. And I think once people see that, one, super low stakes, two, sometimes it gets like funny, right? And like everyone's doing it together. It creates a little bit of energy, like, oh, doing that again is not as hard because I've already done it once. And if there are other like introductory things that you think your group would really enjoy, or like questions that are really pertinent to them, like add that to the top, right, before you jump into the rest of the meeting. And sometimes like it even helps. I do this with new groups of people that I've never hosted a meeting for, is that at the top, I literally write like, this document is yours as much as mine, like write all over it. And I like put that in all caps or something and I bold it. So feel free to be like really on the nose with it too. Sometimes it's rare enough that I don't think people are like, oh, I see that everywhere. And they would actually take your instructions to heart. And Megan just shared another resource for everyone. I'm not sure if I've heard of the Interaction Institute for Social Change before, but I also know that there's a lot of there are a lot of folks who are professional facilitators that I've only just gotten to know. And what looks really cool about this group, similar to Aorta, that I also highly recommend, is that all of their practices are centered around social change. And I find that makes a difference too for who is facilitating your meeting and what techniques do they use. What other questions do folks have? Or also, what can I make more clear? Are there examples of places or meetings where people might join and see these techniques in action? Like if someone wanted to watch you moderate a meeting. Okay, it's a great question. Well, I'll give the first answer that comes to mind first, which is that if you've never personally participated in an interactive meeting style document before while something is happening live, I do recommend checking out the community calls that Open News hosts. So it is not an opportunity to see me do it live, but it is an opportunity to see my co-ED, Erica Owens, do it live. It's a little different setup. It's not a meeting. It's where we like interview community members about their awesome projects or like pieces they've published and like how other people could replicate it, that kind of thing. But there's a similar like live Q&A using a document process that uses Etherpad, and we do it once every 2 weeks. If you've never done it before, this is like a super easy, chill intro to what that could look like live. The other thing is if someone wanted to go to a meeting that I facilitate, I feel like the best bet is probably to join the DI Coalition, because I facilitate the most open-ended, like anyone can come if you're interested meetings there. But community calls, I would say, great introduction to Etherpad to see if you like it. Great introduction to seeing how you feel when you watch a bunch of people type at the same time. So I definitely recommend that. And then, yeah. Next year, SourceCon, which is our annual conference, will be potentially in person. We expect it to be in person, but if it is virtual, then like almost any session at SourceCon has something similar as well. Yes, I was going to ask that at the end, Emma, but I feel like right now is actually a great time. Because I think folks are running out of questions. No, it's all good. So if you do try this out, I would love to know how it goes and like what challenges you run into, but then also like what delightful moments you have when people start to realize like what's going on and how they can participate differently at a meeting. And so if you do this, if you iterate on it, I would super love to know. You can just email me at my email address here. And yeah, thanks for coming, Esther. And I would totally love to know. And I'm also sort of like compiling how people are using it for different types of meetings, because the example I give here for simplicity is just a specific kind of meeting. But there's lots of cool stuff you can do depending on what your goals are. And I feel like the more templates and knowledge that we have shared about that, the easier people's lives are when it comes to planning their meetings and making sure that everyone gets everything they want out of it. So, yeah. If you think of more questions later, feel free to email me as well. But I feel like this is like a very organic, natural concluding time.
All right. Thank you, Sisi. Thank you, everyone. And please reach out. We're going to be putting this recording on our YouTube. So if you want to watch it again later or share it with people, it should be up in a couple hours. All right. Have a good day,
Thank you
everyone.
all. Bye.